Hello and welcome to today's talk. It's a real pleasure to be in virtual touch with you all here today. I just wanted to quickly say sometimes the speakers mention a particular group or charity that they would like to somebody to make a donation to if they want to express their appreciation for a talk. In this case, I would like to put the money back into the Romancing the Gothic kitty, because I think that this is a really important initiative that Sam Hurst is running. And it's a really useful way for people at all different levels of scholarship, general interest, practitioners, to come together and learn from each other that simply wouldn't happen without your support. So if you are delighted, excited about what's happened today, then I'd like any donations to go back to Romancing the Gothic, please. So without further ado, let's get talking about witchcraft and magic. So I'm going to start with just a little note about the European and USA historical context. And this is really just a little note to get your brains thinking. As Sam mentioned, there's a conference potentially coming up all about witchcraft. There might be some sources that you want to have a look at. There might be some ideas that you want to play with. So I just want to outline in a very general terms some of the things that you might want to be thinking about in this area. So historical accounts of witchcraft are really interesting in their own right, but it's worth thinking carefully about making distinctions between actual witches, people accused of witchcraft, and the broader contexts in societies where fears of witchcraft took place. And it's worth remembering that when you have a so-called witchcraft craze, that this is as much about the fantasies about witches as it is about any historical events that actually took place. So, for example, witchcraft trials will tell us what people were worried about, but not necessarily what the people accused of actually did. Now, one of the most useful ways to find sources on this era is to think about witchcraft, early modern Europe. Those are the terms that I put into Cardiff when I was looking to get some sources in this area, and loads of things came up. So if we want to think about more towards the modern day, so I'm thinking late 1800s, early 1900s onwards, really, is this kind of formation gradually of feminist witchcraft and modern witches. And what you sometimes find is that particularly in the present day, there is sometimes a connection made between what happened in the past and the present that is as much about forming a present identity as it is about unpicking the past. And it's worth kind of unfolding that a little bit, unpacking that a little bit. Because, for example, scholars like Ronald Hutton have explained the ways in which there are actually breaks in the historical period between the kind of folk practices that might have been thought to have been around in the early modern period and the kind of practices and tools and books that are used by many modern witches, some of which were actually collated as late as the 1930s and 40s. Another person who's really good to help us unpack these histories is Diane Purkis. And she looks specifically at this idea of the burning times and the ways in which modern feminists have associated the witch trials with patriarchy and with changes in society that suggested there was a kind of doubling down of patriarchy. And while that idea, certainly as a very broad idea, has interest, what we can do accidentally, if you like, is kind of turn people who were accused of witchcraft in the early modern period into early proto-feminists. And that certainly wasn't always the case. Some of them had some really interesting behaviors and things to say, but that doesn't mean that we can automatically equate it with what was going on in the 1960s and 70s in the feminist movement. And someone like Perkins gives us the detail to help us unpack those ideas and to give us a much more rich picture of what was going on. So what about witchcraft on modern TV? I've got a couple of examples here because I think most of them will be familiar to you, and also they contrast each other quite nicely. So in the first example, you've got the chilling adventures of Sabrina, and here we've got a motif that pops up in witchcraft trials quite regularly, which is the idea of the Sabbat and the idea that the witch had to literally do a deal with the devil. And that, this is a written document. Quite often there's this idea in the witchcraft trials that somebody witnessed somebody else sign this document that was a deal with the devil. And they play with this idea in the chilling adventures of Sabrina, although she's a modern witch. And as the program goes on, it begins to challenge patriarchy, to challenge ideas about Lucifer and the Dark Lord and so on and so forth. So it kind of starts with a trope and then twists it and uses it in a really modern way. The other program, which I thought was really interesting, was Charmed. And I'm thinking of the original series. I know it's been reproduced, but I haven't seen the new one. But I think that this one has a lot of tropes and ideas that are perhaps more familiar to modern pagan witchcraft. There's ideas of the beings from above. There's ideas to do with wanting something positive, but you can't ask for it for yourself. So you can only use your powers for somebody else's good. And I've seen that recorded by anthropologists observing present day witchcraft, that some of the meetings, they ask people to kind of meditate on wanting to change something, but it's got to be a positive change for somebody else. And it's got to be framed in such a way that they have some agency. So, positive change from their point of view kind of business. So what about Buffy the Vampire Slayer itself? This is a television series that lasted from 1997 to 2003. Joss Whedon is credited as the creator, but there are multiple writers and directors. And Stacey Abbott wrote an article that famously argues that this is an example of a modern vampire story. And the article is entitled "A Little Less Ritual and a Little More Fun," as a quote from Spike. Now, I think this article has a lot of merit. I mean, Stacey's work is very well known in the field. But one of the problems with it is that while the ritual certainly changes a little bit after season 1, and the kind of religiosity of vampires and so on, it does change a little bit. Nonetheless, there is a shared load of ritual in this program right through all of the seasons. So the idea that ritual disappears doesn't quite work. Now, I'm going to pick out some examples that are particularly useful for illustrating some of the basic points that I want to make. But I'm well aware that this is, it's literally a slice. And there's going to be plenty more examples and angles that you, as quite a wide audience that are bringing diverse experiences, might want to think about and talk about. So please feel free in the questions when we come to the end to kind of go off tangents a bit and bring up other episodes and other examples, because I'm very happy to talk about them. So just a little bit about my own approach. I am publishing a book. It's hopefully coming out in August, called Dreams, Vampires and Ghosts. Here's the cover. I'm very proud of the cover. The book is essentially, it's taking the discipline of the anthropology of religion and asking, what can somebody who's versed to some extent in this discipline potentially offer the study of film and television? The example, I do have a chapter on Buffy in that book, but you won't find that chapter mapping onto this talk precisely. So that chapter actually looks at the trope of demonic possession and vampirism in Buffy the Vampire Slayer and how all of that works. But I think that there are some general things about the approach that are quite similar. Now, one of the things I'm going to suggest is that it would be extremely difficult to map the Buffyverse, so the kind of created world, onto one tradition or one way of doing things. And so I'm not going to try and map it precisely onto these various ways of looking at witchcraft. Instead, what I'm going to suggest is that the Buffyverse is a little social world in and of itself, and that it can be looked at using some of the tools that have kind of become part of my toolkit, if you like, as somebody who's interested in the anthropologist of religion. So just to very briefly explain what that might mean, the term anthropology is not terribly helpful. It covers the study of human beings, which could mean almost anything. But in practice, most anthropologists are people who want to find out about the culture that they're studying by spending quality time with the specific people. So there's something called participant observation, which means that you hang out with people and you kind of learn a lot of the time through making mistakes, through figuring out you've got to take off your shoes somewhere, oh, you don't speak in this bit of the ritual, etc., etc. And almost as you kind of learn from your mistakes, you begin to understand that social world and how it works. So back to Buffy. I think that Amy's story is really quite important in terms of understanding how magic works in the series and how the ways that ritual and witchcraft are portrayed have kind of transformed as the series goes along. So Amy appears in the very first story about witchcraft, which is season 1, episode 3, The Witch. And she is a victim initially of a witch that resembles the kind of evil witch in fairy tale tellings, such as the Disney production of Snow White, and also these kind of images that people might have got from things to do with the witchcraft trials. Amy's mother is jealous of her youth and uses magic to swap their bodies so that she can literally steal her youth for herself. And it's got all of these kind of typical iconic images of things like cauldrons. And as you can see, there's a doll dressed up there. So it's like what you do to the doll will happen to the person. And that's a form of magic called sympathetic magic. It's the idea that like resembles like. So if you do something to something that resembles the person, you can do a version of that thing to the person. Now, Amy's story progresses and she manages to escape from the clutches of her evil mother with the help of Buffy and her friends. And then she starts practicing magic for herself. And she becomes what you might call a normal, calm, low-grade witch, does the odd protection spell with her friends, this kind of stuff. And then in Gingerbread, which is, we've got on to the 3rd season now, so the 3rd season, episode 11, there's a series of events which kind of tries to work with the idea of how might the witchcraft trials have happened, how easy it is for people to become overwhelmed with emotions and for societies to kind of go a little bit crazy. And it also has this link with fairy tales. But in this case, the fairy tale that's real is a monster who pretends that it's actually Hansel and Gretel who've been murdered by the evil witch. And so you get this kind of witch cry that started up and is, again, you know, there's this thing about mothers. It's Buffy's mother and Willow's mother, actually, who fuel this craze and start up this thing called Mothers Opposed to the Occult. And they burn books and they try to burn witches. Now, Amy, who's not depicted here because I couldn't get a good picture of it, but she's actually alongside the other two when the crowd are trying to burn them. She calls upon the Greek goddess Hecate and is transformed into a rat so that she can escape. Now, this is quite interesting because it illustrates the way that someone who was initially a Greek goddess, so in the ancient Greek world, Hecate was responsible for transformations. She was kind of on the boundaries of things. And then gradually in the period, she became more and more involved with the underworld. And then by the time of the stories of Medea, Medea is thought to have learnt from Hecate evil potions and poisons. And so Hecate becomes this kind of mistress of black magic. But modern feminists have reclaimed figures like Hecate, thinking of her as an example of a crone figure. So in modern witchcraft, it's very popular to talk about the maiden, the mother, and the crone as three aspects of kind of symbolism of the female. And what they suggest is that while the maiden and the mother are still kind of quite popular in patriarchal society because they serve the function of reproducing that society, not just physically, but in so many ways, you know, the way that motherhood reproduces culture, if you like. The crone is almost discarded and quite often reviled because she's no longer forming that reproductive function, but she's got a lot of experience and can speak out. And so there's very much the idea in modern witchcraft of reclaiming the crone, one example of whom is Hecate. It doesn't want to do the thing for some strange reason. There we go. Patience rewards all. Witchcraft and goddess spirituality. So this kind of phenomenon that I'm talking about has been written really well by Catherine Roundtree, who's written a book called Embracing the Witch and the Goddess. And she was working as an anthropologist, so working very closely with a community of modern witches in New Zealand. And she explains how important feminism is for some modern witches. She also explains that beliefs and rituals that include goddess spirituality, such as those from ancient Greece, are a modern, they're not just a reclamation, they're a modern invention. So even the people themselves are aware of the fact that just because in ancient Greece there were goddesses, it doesn't mean that it was this kind of feminist utopia. There were still problems with patriarchy in ancient Greece. And one of the examples of that is the way that space and public and private life tended to be divided, so that men were on the street, in public, doing politics, and women were in the home, and if the man had a guest come round, the woman had to hide, and all of this kind of nonsense. So we can't just assume, because there's goddesses around, that there's liberation. But nonetheless, what goddesses do provide are choice and the kind of the ability to consider symbols, to change symbols, and to think about how symbolism and identity work. And I think that's what goddess spirituality offers to a lot of people who are also practicing or reclaiming the image of the witch. So as I was explaining, the crone here is the symbol that is reclaimed by feminists, and she can appear as someone like Hecate, or she can also appear as the witch and be transformed into a figure of power that's also kind of looking at the dark side, you know, women being able to embrace their darker sides and the sides of them that are not necessarily acceptable to the patriarchal society around them. So one of the questions that I wanted to address in this series is the idea of magic as metaphor. So I think it's fairly well known that magic in many of the episodes, is used as a metaphor or analogy to explore social and psychological issues. And quite often there's a social and psychological issue that's kind of worked out through some encounter with magic. But I think it's worth remembering that if we are in the Buffyverse itself, magic is also real. So the people in the Buffyverse aren't just using magic as kind of a symbol. It's there and you need it. It is a weapon. It is a defense strategy. It lights lights, etc., etc. So in that sense, it's very practical and uses techniques such as book learning, conjuring weapons, and other forms of help versus demons. Now, for this reason, it makes an awful lot of sense that Willow, who's an expert in tech and book learning and science, is also a very competent witch. So there's this idea that there's this competence, if you like, that translates across the fields of witchcraft and the more mundane academic sciences. So have anthropologists examined societies in which witchcraft and magic are understood to be real? Indeed, they have. And one of the earliest examples is a chap called Malinowski. It's not spelt that way, but I think it sounds that way. Now, we have to remember that Malinowski is writing in like 1925. So some of his ideas about the ways in which the differences between European societies and societies that he was studying, like the Trabayan Islands in Melanesia, there's a kind of a language around that that assumes that somehow modern societies came from, you know, it's almost like they're putting people that they're studying in the present into the past and assuming that there's this kind of evolution into technology, which is seen as progress. And I think that idea has largely been debunked by modern anthropologists, not least because there's difference. Societies that they were studying also had a past, not always documented in quite the same way as Western societies, but they did. So that they were and still are going through transformation. And we can't just assume that our past is somebody else's present. It just doesn't work like that. And it also ties in with kind of ideas about colonialism, which hopefully we are beginning to deconstruct now and ask difficult questions about. So why would I talk about a chap who is a part of that colonial period in some of his ideas and ways of thinking? The main reason is that he had some really interesting things to say about how spells actually work. And his argument was that spells are formed, they're a kind of codified, refined way of expressing the emotion that the magician wants to try and harness and transmit to somebody else. So, for example, with anger, there are spells, there are words, there are gestures, and then there are magical implements that are used to kind of hone in and refine and zap whoever you want to zap with, you know, he's got more money than me, I want him to be poor forever, kind of thing. And it's a way of kind of, this is your frame of mind, I'm angry, but you're honing that in such a way as you're creating a transformation in the world for somebody else. And I think that idea is a really interesting idea that you still find in a lot of places, not least Buffy the Vampire Slayer. So another example of looking at anthropologists who have been involved and gone to other places rather than looked at Europe and America is Paul Stoller. And I've partly chosen him because his example is much more recent. The book that I'm mentioning here in Sorcery's Shadow is 1987. And therefore he is much more closely involved, much more emotionally involved, I would say, with the people that he's studying. He knows their language. He goes as far as to wanting to become an apprentice to a magician in Niger. And he's also very, very interested in magicians' words. And he is interested in something called sensuous anthropology. So he's interested in the sounds, the smells, the ways in which other worlds can kind of infuse us and can potentially transform somebody who visits another place in ways that can't always be captured by these rather cold, distant accounts that tended to be written in earlier periods. There were, however, dangers. He explains that he had to leave the field at one point because he wasn't feeling terribly well and he was having bad dreams. And he suspected that the rival to the magician who was offering him an apprenticeship was attacking him. And so he had to go home. So while in some ways this kind of anthropology is much more embracing of the wider cultural spectrum, there are dangers to that there is such a thing as getting too close. So how are these similar principles operated in a series like Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Well, there's one example where Giles reverses Amy's mother's spell. And when he's doing this, he makes an offering of his own energy. But he also, and he's speaking in English in this example, making commands. He's kind of ordering the forces of nature to release in order to reverse this spell, to kind of release the hold on Amy, if you like. But there's also the idea in the programme that words have a power beyond their meaning, both as sounds and as writing. And Latin and other archaic languages are seen as especially volatile in this way. So you've got this lovely example with Xander, who says, well, you can't just go, librum incendere. And the book kind of lights itself on fire. So even though he doesn't really know what he's doing, he's not thinking about what he's doing, but he is creating this action just by saying the words. Now, clearly this can go wrong. And there's lots of interesting examples about how it goes wrong. And many of them are related to Willow's journey, which is quite a long and complex journey throughout the different seasons. And by the time she gets to season 4, she's gained quite a lot of competence, but there's also kind of a level of maturation and uncertainty, which I think to some extent is kind of symbolizing our general competence as human beings at that age. You know, we're doing pretty well, but we're still testing our own boundaries. We're still trying to learn who we are. And what is focused on, they use magic as an idea to do with the focus and control of emotions and the mind, and how that can impact on spells. So in this particular instance, it's in the episode Fear Itself. They've entered a haunted house, which was kind of supposed to be a jokey party thing, but somebody has enacted a symbol that they didn't know what it was, that was written on the floor by accident when they cut their finger and some blood fell on it. And so everything in the house that was kind of meant to be fearful actually manifests, and the fears of all of the characters actually manifest in different ways. And Buffy has a row with Willow because Willow is trying to solve the problem by magic, and Buffy's kind of going, you know, are you overdoing it with magic, etc., etc. And Willow kind of goes off in a huff and says, no, I'm going to use these like little magic lights to lead me to people so we can all kind of get back together and get sorted. So she gets the light going, but the problem is she can't make her mind up what needs to be done first. And so in the end, you've got all of these little lights swarming around her, kind of illustrating her confusion. Now, some of the best examples of when spells go wrong is, of course, with love spells. And the two most famous examples, I think, in the series are Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, which is in the second season, episode 16, and Something Blue in the fourth season, episode 9. So in Bewitched, Bothered and Bewildered, surprisingly enough, Amy pops up again as somebody that Xander turns to when he's spurned in love. So Xander has been dated Cordelia, who sees herself as the kind of the popular girl, and she's a little bit nervous about the Scoobies because they're a bit nerdy in her opinion, etc., etc. And her friends tease her about this relationship. And so she finishes with Xander on Valentine's Day, and he's deeply hurt about all this and demands back a necklace that he tried to give her, and goes off in a huff and realizes that Amy's powers as a magician are coming on, actually. And he says, I know what I'll do. I'll cast a spell on Cordelia to make her love me. Bad idea. So the end result of this is that, surprise, surprise, the spell goes wrong. And it's quite interesting because Amy does say, well, your intentions should be pure. You know, the fact that you're angry is not really a good thing to kind of put into a love spell. But he doesn't take any notice of that. He wants what he wants. And everybody falls into this kind of obsessive lust with him, apart, of course, from Cordelia. So he's running away from all of these women, madly trying to initiate some sort of relationship with him. And at one point, he's running off with Cordelia, who can't understand why the world has gone mad. But weirdly, he does get what he wants in the end, because she realizes that he was so into her that he cast this spell. And so she kind of thinks that that's a bit cute, and they get back together. So even though the spell didn't work, it kind of did. And you get this in Buffy quite a lot, that the spell goes wrong, but nonetheless, it moves the narrative action forward in such a way that understanding and so on and so forth do happen. Now, there's something quite similar going on in Something Blue, but this time it's Willow, who is sad because her relationship with Oz has finished. And she's in that phase of not really being able to get over it. So she's tired of her grieving, everybody else is tired of her grieving. She's really struggling with this process of moving forward from this relationship. And so in a kind of a bit of a huff, she casts a spell for her will to be done. Now, this is really quite interesting, because what happens is that when she tries, when she kind of says, oh, you know, I will this Q-tip to go unboundy, or she wills herself to be healed, doesn't work. So when she states what she thinks is her intention, it has no kind of effect on the world. However, things that she says that she doesn't even realize what she's doing all work. So at one point, there's Amy behind her as a rat, and she's saying, yeah, 1 minute Amy is like a perfectly normal human being, poof, and you see a perfectly normal human being. And then she's a rat again, and poof, she goes back to a rat. And she's like, I could never do something like that. So it's that idea that it's almost unconscious, and that we need to think about what will means, because will is not necessarily our most immediate desire or our most apparent conscious desire. And then things kind of go horribly wrong, because she has a row with Giles, who says, well, you know, I do see what's going on for you. And she's like, no, you don't see at all. And Giles goes blind. And then she's complaining to Xander about Buffy, because Buffy's had to go off and find Spike. Spike has been somewhat incapacitated at this point. He can't bite people because of this chip in his head. But he still can't just be left running around. They need him for information and various other reasons. So she has to go and find Spike, who's escaped. But Willow is quite angry about this, because she feels that Buffy should be kind of spending this time consoling her. She feels like a bit let down by her friend. And so she's talking to Xander about this, and she says, well, I don't know why she can't just come and marry Spike. So of course, then there's this hilarity ensues as Spike and Buffy are betrothed and making kissing, smacking noises in the background to a rather horrified Giles. He's like, no, please make it stop. And then she's complaining again to Xander and saying, well, that he's a demon magnet, because he's had so many relationships with demons. And again, you know, her will is kind of manifested by all of these demons chasing him. So on one level, all of these events are completely unconscious. And I think that on one level, it's a very humorous narrative device. But on another level, what it's trying to suggest is that our intentions are not necessarily what they realize they are. And that perhaps we need to think a little bit more carefully about our words, because they might have a power beyond what we thought they would have. So what about anthropological studies of modern witchcraft in the Western world? I think one of the best examples to go to initially for this is Susan Greenwood, who this is the first book that she wrote, Magic, Witchcraft and the Other World, which I think is quite good because it frames what she's doing quite nicely, but she's written a shed load of stuff. It's well worth having a look at any of her books. And she does ethnographic studies with various witchcraft and Wicca groups. So, she does both high magic and nature magic, and compares and contrasts. And a bit like Stoller, her involvement does have things like interviews and participating in rituals and observing rituals and so on and so forth. But it is also, she engages in practices to do with visualization and altered states of consciousness. So her involvement in that sense is quite deep and it's quite complex. And there's this idea in some of the rituals that she does that it's kind of almost like limbering up to be able to experience something called the other world. And I think that it's possible from this anthropology to kind of see that participants are interpreting that in at least two ways, and that sometimes that distinction is blurred. So sometimes it's about the power of visualization and imagination to transform oneself and the world. And I think sometimes, in some cases, it's more literally, there is another world and these magical practices enable one to get into communication with it. Does this happen in Buffy the Vampire Slayer? Yes, indeed it does. So trance and visualization are practices that we find particularly in some of the later episodes. So as the magical practices and their practitioners become more competent, it's seen as a more advanced form of magic. And one of the examples is in the episode, Who Are You? And it's a really good example of how Willow and Tara work together so that this kind of sensitivity to the other world isn't just a lone thing. They actually do quite a lot of practices together, which is about attunement, which I can imagine is a bit like being in a band. If you're practicing together, it's that way of kind of tuning into different harmonies and gaining different kinds of foci and control. And in this episode, what's happened is that Faith, who, long story, not going to try and go into it all, but she's basically another vampire slayer. She went rogue, she went evil, bad stuff happened between her and Buffy. She was in a coma, she came out of a coma, she took her revenge by swapping bodies with Buffy. Oh yes, it's the magic body swap again. So Willow is hoping to introduce her new friend Tara to Buffy. And she thinks she's doing so, but it's not Buffy, it's Faith in Buffy clothing. And Faith is kind of quite mean to Tara. And I think as an audience, we're a little bit worried because we're thinking, oh, you know, is Tara going to think that Buffy's not really her friend? Which is actually what she says to Willow. But, what she says to Willow. But Tara's really smart. And when she says that, she doesn't mean, oh, she's not really a good friend to you. What she means is, no, that's not really your friend. That's not her in her body, because the energy doesn't flow properly. She looks fractured. And so what Willow suggests is that they do a ritual to go into the netherworld so that they can actually find out what happened and where Buffy's soul is. And in this ritual, Tara acts as the anchor for Willow. So what she does is she keeps her grounded so that she doesn't get lost in this netherworld. So we have this quite lovely scene where they're working together and entering into this other world to try and solve a problem, which to all of our great relief, they do, and the bodies get swapped back again. So to come to my very last example, this is an example which I think combines a lot of the themes that I've been talking about. It's the episode No Place Like Home, Series 5, Episode 5. And on the one hand, we have one of the more mundane sides, if you like, of modern magic, because it's the opening day of the magic shop. And here is Giles in his magical hat, dressed up as a warlock, all ready to sell candle and incense and all kinds of new age things to a populace who might be quite mixed. You know, in the Buffyverse, some people might be going in there because they like magic candles. Some people might be going in there because they're proper witches and doing kind of high-class spells, and there's this whole mixture there. At the same time, there is the underlying theme of how actual illness and death and grief cannot be overturned by magic. This is a tricky theme in the series, but at least in this point in the series, the idea is that one can distinguish the two things. And Buffy is really worried because her mum is ill and she thinks somebody might have put a spell on her. So Anya suggests that Buffy casts a spell to see spells, which is inspired by the practices of a 16th century French sorcerer within the story. So again, this is a meditative practice Buffy sits down, she lights candles, she spreads a magical circle of sand, and she does this meditation where her vision is altered, if you like, and the way it's depicted is like a kind of altered state of consciousness. It's a bit difficult to show from this picture, but what you see is these kind of two worlds, because Dawn, who she believes is her sister, is actually a magical being who has been transformed by monks in order to get Buffy to protect her. And so Buffy sees Dawn kind of, fading in and out, and realizes that Dawn is the magical being, the magical spell that she couldn't see. Now, this gets tied back in to the mother theme, because this is the episode where Buffy matures, where Buffy goes from being sick of having a kid sister to starting to feel those early maternal feelings and feelings of responsibility for another person. And so, again, I would say throughout the series, actually, magic and witchcraft and motherhood, both the positive and the negative sides of all of that, are all interlinked. So in that sense, I think that within the series, the idea of metaphor is certainly really important, and the ways in which it explores symbolism. But I think it's really useful to remember that within the Buffyverse, magic is real. And for some people, in some parts of the world, including our parts of the world, magic is real.